Bjorn?
Thank you very much. And this is always the danger when you do slides, right? And then everybody else talks about something entirely different, and some of it is overlap. So what I would like to just do, because the way I see this, this session is really about why we need innovation beyond carbon taxes. And so one of the things I just wanted to walk you through, and it was also a conversation that I had with several of you afterwards, what do you think about carbon tax? And obviously any economist worth his salt will say, or her salt will say carbon taxes, and then we kind of fix the problem. And I'd like to show you a little bit about why that's probably not correct. It's still, you know, from an economist point of view, a good solution, but it's just not going to do very much. I alluded to it last night. But the slide, the first slide that you can see here is what we see from the historical carbon emissions from 1900 till 2010-ish. And then you see what the UN climate panel tells us we have to do if we want to get to either, to 1.5 degrees. And one guy commented on this on Twitter and said, you know, when I show this to my students, I invariably get laughter. You know, there's just no way we're going to see the world do this. We've seen dramatic increases in carbon emissions, and we're basically expecting them not only to drop to pretty much zero in a couple of decades, but in a couple of decades after that, we will be sucking all that CO2 out of the atmosphere that is equivalent to what we emitted just a couple of decades ago. That's just not going to happen. To give you a sense of why that's the case, if you look at, this is the carbon taxes that the UN estimate if we were going to make it to 1.5 degrees. And I've helpfully also indicated what that would be equivalent in tax on gasoline. And obviously that's just a very small part of it, but a lot of people have sort of a closer sense of what a carbon tax would say. This is the median, so notice that there's a huge difference in the lowest and the highest outcomes. So we'll start with just under $1,000 per ton of CO2 in 2030, and we'll end up about almost $7,000. Or to put it differently, we'll charge gasoline in 2030 of about $8 per extra per gallon, and we'll end up with about $60 per gallon of gasoline. And remember, this is not just for rich people in rich countries. This would also be true everywhere. This would have to happen in Ethiopia, in China, in India, and everywhere else. And I think it's fair to say, yeah, that's not going to happen. And that's important because, and that goes to your point in somewhat saying, we need to recognize that just because there is an optimal solution, it doesn't necessarily end up happening. I talked to you about, this is Nordhaus models, his latest estimates. So what you see here is if we do nothing, we simply keep emitting more and more CO2 into the atmosphere through the 21st century, but we sort of see it tapering off towards the end of the century, very similar to the business as usual as I showed you yesterday. Nordhaus talks about, well, what about if we did an optimal carbon tax, which would start at about $30, so close to what you're talking about, end up at about $100 per ton of carbon at the end of the century. And that would, as you can see, significantly reduce the emissions. It would immediately reduce the emissions, perhaps 7 gigatons, and then we would see an even larger gap towards the end of the century. So clearly we can do something. But again, remember, this requires us to not just convince the US to do this, which certainly has seemed like a hard job in the past, but also convince everyone else in the developed world to do this. Remember, the European Union is the only real place where we've had a significant sort of move towards a strong climate policy. And we still only have a carbon tax of about $8 per ton of CO2, which is what the estimate across all sectors is estimated by Nordhaus. And perhaps crucially, we don't have one carbon tax. In Europe, we probably have, and it's really, really hard to estimate, but we probably have a couple of hundred different carbon taxes because of a bewildering array of different incentive structures and different things that are taxed at different rates. And remember, we actually have a unitary policy-making unit, and yet we can't get it anywhere close to straight. We simply have so many different rates of carbon taxes, which at least would be second best, but often would be dramatically more less than that. And of course, getting everybody else, so China and India and everybody else, would be almost impossible to envision to get them on board for a rational, unitary, increasing carbon tax across the century. And yet, just to look at the last ones, the other ones will get us to 2.5 degrees, or the Stern outcome, which are essentially the same, basically eradicating fossil fuel emissions, CO2 emissions in a couple of decades, and it would require the same sort of thousands of dollars of CO2 taxes, which of course are pretty close to impossible to imagine to happen. But if you look at that, and I alluded to that yesterday, if you look at the temperature outcome, it's very small difference, right? We have a temperature outcome, again, in Nordhaus model, but we see the same sort of thing all across these models. If we don't do anything, 4.1 degrees. If we do the optimal outcome, we will get a temperature increase. And I'm sorry, I actually wrote 3.5 degrees. I've updated my slide as well, 3.5 degrees. So we will see a difference, but not a huge one. And even if we manage to get the 4,000 or more dollars of carbon tax, we'll still see a significant temperature increase, but one that is smaller. So the reality is to recognize that even if we get all of this right, we're only going to solve a part of it, and actually a fairly small part of it. And that was what I was showing you yesterday with the cost. If I just take all of these, so basically the costs, no matter what we end up doing, is on the same order of magnitude. We're talking about somewhere between 2.3 and 4% of GDP. It's important, and that's what economists would say. You know, we want to make sure that we get that extra benefit, that we get the 0.7% reduction in cost from the no policy, the 4.1 degree no policy, to the 3.5 degree optimal policy. But that requires us to get a lot of stuff right. And if we get it even a little bit wrong, we're probably going to get less than 0.7% of total social benefits across the 21st century. And there's a good chance if we screw it up reasonably largely, we will not even do that, and we might even get it worse. So while a carbon tax is in principle a good idea, there's a lot of ways that we can end up doing it badly, and there's very little likelihood that it will politically fly. Again, remember, we talk about $40 of carbon tax, maybe escalating towards $100 by the end of the century. Globally, Nordhaus estimate that the world has a carbon tax that's equivalent to $2 today. So after 30 years of climate conversations, we've gotten almost no way on doing that. And that's why I would argue that we need to recognize there's another way that we need to focus on. That's the energy investment in research and development into green energy. Because fundamentally, if we can make green energy cheap enough, if we can innovate the price down of green energy so that it's cheaper than fossil fuels, we will have solved global warming. If we can't do that, we'll continuously have to rely on putting carbon taxes on, which are both economically and morally, in a sense, the right answer, but the one that's very hard to do, and very hard to do in a way that'll actually garner most of the economic benefit. So we're stuck between saying, let's try something that's going to be very, very hard and won't actually solve very much of the problem and could very easily be screwed up, or let's try to do innovation. So one of the things I see when I look across history of innovation, or sorry, human history, is that innovation really has been the main way that we've solved problems. If you think back to the 1860s, we were hunting whales like crazy, right? Because whales just happened to have this wonderful oil that just burnt much brighter and much cleaner. And that was why most homes in rich countries, both in Europe and the US, were lit by these whales. And of course, hence why we were hunting down the whales with abandon. The problem with a carbon tax solution or a moralistic approach to to not hunting so many whales is that it's really hard to go out and tell people, I'm sorry, could you turn down the lights a little bit? Could you not have it so bright? Could you perhaps stop using that and just sit in the dark? That rarely works with people, right? And the carbon tax solution would be to dramatically increase the cost of this oil, which would at best be politically incredibly hard. What did solve the problem was that we discovered oil. We discovered another technology that just happened to be both cheaper, more efficient, and actually generate even lighter light in the homes in the 1870s and onwards, which was why people just essentially gave up on whale oil. Why have all the trouble, and it's not quite as good, and it's more costly? That's what saved the whales. It's not entirely the full story, but it's most of the story. And it gives you a good sense of, if you get a better technology, we can fix the problem. And we've done this many times again. If you think back in the 1960s, almost everyone worried about that we were not going to be able to feed the world. Again, the sense was, and I think I was told that, at least I have this imagination of it, but don't eat so much. We need to send some of this down to the poor Africans to have something to eat. And of course, that doesn't work. You can't tell people, could you please eat a little less so there's food to everyone else? That's rarely going to be a good solution. What did work was the Green Revolution, that we actually managed to find technologies, better yields, better water management, pesticides, and certainly artificial fertilizer. Those points made it possible for India to go from a dramatic net importer of food to a net exporter. It made it possible for us to see hunger being driven down by about half or more over the last 25 years. There's still a huge problem, and we can talk about that as well. But the fundamental issue here is technology enables us to solve problems much, much easier, whereas asking people, could you please go without, is always going to be very, very hard. And that's why I would argue, yes, we should think about a carbon tax, because there is an efficiency point to be made. But we should also recognize that there's a very good chance that we'll end up mostly deadlocking, certainly in the US as I see it, but also many other places, on focusing on a policy that, even if done well, will only solve a little bit of the problem. And that's why I'm more for saying, let's focus first and foremost on innovation. And unfortunately, we don't spend very much on innovation. This is the International Energy Agency estimate of how much we spend on innovation. So you can see we've now gotten up to almost 0.02% of GDP, which is like 10 times less than what we spend on most other major technology issues. And if you take this in percentage of GDP, it's even less. There is a slight trend upward, but nowhere near what we're actually arguing is this huge challenge that we're facing. So some years ago, actually, I don't know if you remember back when we had the Copenhagen Climate Conference that was supposed to fix the world and didn't. But we gathered 27 climate economists, 3 Nobel laureates, to look across all areas to look at where can you spend a dollar and do the most good for climate. So adaptation, tech transfer, invest in forest, obviously carbon tax, and geoengineering, as was mentioned yesterday, many other things. And the best long-term strategy was to dramatically increase investment in research and development of green energy. Why? Because if we dramatically increase more, it's much, much cheaper than anything else we can imagine, and it will increase the likelihood of when green energy is going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. And of course, when that happens, and that's not an easy sort of crossover point because it depends on a lot of different technologies, but when that happens, we're essentially going to see everyone switch. Not just because we have this conversation about, oh my God, we got to do something about global warming, but simply because the green energy is cheaper, more efficient, better. So it's exactly the same thing as saying, I don't want to use whale oil anymore, not because I care about the whales, but simply because I care about how I light my room. It's much, much easier to convince everyone if we can do it that way. And that's why we need to dramatically ramp up the spending. We found that every dollar spent on research and development will deliver $11 of social benefits. That's a significant benefits, one of the highest that we found in the climate conversation. And the beauty of that is, of course, this is something that everyone can start doing. You don't actually need a global compact. And wonderfully, so we argue that we should get up to about $100 billion. Remember, we spend about $300 billion right now in investment in green energy. We spend, as I mentioned yesterday, more than $150 billion on subsidies to green energy, which delivers fairly little. So there's lots of money that could be spent on doing that. Right now, the world spends about $15 billion. It depends a little bit on how you estimate it. This is the IEA. And what we suggest is get up to about $100 billion. So it'll at least be somewhere between a 6- and a 10-fold increase in that spending. But it'll be much cheaper, both than what we're currently spending on subsidies to green energy. It'll be much, much cheaper than what we're proposing to spend on the Paris Agreement, even if we do it effectively. And it will have a much greater chance of ultimately solving global warming. Because again, remember, it's not about cutting carbon emissions next year that's the important thing. It's about how much we cut throughout the century, pretty much. It's not entirely true, but it's almost true. It's about the number of gigatons that we emitted, or alternatively, that we cut over the 21st century. And so we can try and cut a little bit now, which is basically what the Paris Agreement is trying to do. That's even what a carbon tax would try to do. Or we can try to make sure that we'll cut a lot in the long run through cheaper technology. That's why it's really great, and I don't know if many of you heard about it. It was certainly totally not the main story. But on the sidelines of Paris, Obama and all the other state leaders from 20 countries met with Bill Gates and a lot of the other billionaires to promise to double their spending on green energy. It's actually going in the right direction. They're spending about $3 billion more. That's not nearly enough of what they promised. They should probably be up at about $7 billion more per year. But at least it's going in the right direction. And this is exactly argued on the basis of both what we found and some other researchers have indicated that this is an incredible investment. This was on the sideline of Paris. It got almost no headlines. But that, I would argue, is what's actually going to fix climate change. If we can make it, we're going to make it just like we've done most other times, because we actually get the technology to make sure that this becomes a cheap and easy thing to do rather than a difficult and costly one to do. Thanks.
Okay.